The judge looked down at the paper in his hand for a long time, not at me, not at my ex-husband, at one single line. And when he finally looked up, I watched the color drain from Nathan's face, like someone had pulled a plug. I remember thinking, there it is. I was 31 years old the first time I understood what it meant to be completely alone. Not the kind of alone that comes from a quiet house or a long weekend without plans. The kind where you're lying in a hospital bed at 3 a.m, your left leg in a frame that looks like something out of a science fiction film, and you realize the person who promised to be there isn't coming. My phone kept lighting up on the tray table beside me. I kept not looking at it. His name was Nathan. We'd been married 6 years. We lived in a semi-detached in Hamilton, Ontario, with a cracked driveway and a backyard that flooded every spring no matter how many times we had someone come to look at it. We had a dog named Pepper that was more his than mine, and a son named Owen who was 4 months old when I left for my second rotation with the Disaster Relief Coordination Unit out of Ottawa. I want to be clear about something, because I've seen people get confused about this kind of work. I wasn't in a combat zone. I was a logistics coordinator. I worked with a civilian contracted relief organization that partnered with the federal government on emergency response, floods, infrastructure collapse, that kind of thing. That particular deployment took me to a region in northern Manitoba that had experienced a catastrophic dam failure. We were on the ground helping coordinate supply chains and temporary housing. Dangerous in its own way, unstable structures, unpredictable conditions, equipment that failed in the cold. But not what anyone would call a battlefield. The accident happened on a Tuesday. A piece of temporary scaffolding gave way. I fell approximately 4 meters onto frozen ground and landed badly enough that the medical team on site thought, for a while, that I might not walk again. They airlifted me to a hospital in Winnipeg. Then they transferred me to a rehabilitation center in Burlington, closer to home. Nathan visited twice. Once in Winnipeg, when the prognosis was still unclear, and he sat in a chair across the room and didn't hold my hand once. And once in Burlington, about 3 weeks in, when he told me he couldn't do this. I can't be a single parent, he said. I didn't sign up for this. I looked at him. Owen was 4 months old. He was at Nathan's mother's place 40 minutes away. I had not held my son in 6 weeks. You're not a single parent, I said. I'm still here. He left 2 days later. Took Pepper. Left Owen with me, with us, I should say, because my younger sister Brenda had driven up from Brantford the week before and hadn't gone home. She slept on the fold-out in my room and learned how to do Owen's 3 a.m. feeding without waking me when I was finally getting rest, and she never once made me feel like I owed her anything for it. Nathan moved in with a woman named Tara. They'd apparently been seeing each other for 4 months. I did the math while I was doing my physio exercises one morning, single leg presses, gripping the side of the machine until my knuckles were white, and I realized he had started that relationship when Owen was 3 weeks old. I didn't cry about Nathan. I want to be honest about that. I think I had used up whatever grief I had for that marriage somewhere in the 6 weeks before the accident, during all the arguments about deployments and priorities, and what kind of life we were supposed to be building. The marriage had been failing long before I fell off that scaffolding. He just used the falling as his exit. What I cried about was Owen. Lying in that bed, reading his weight updates from my sister, looking at photos of him on my phone at 2 a.m, that was what broke me open. I had left him when he was a newborn, barely out of the fog of those first few weeks, and now I was watching him grow up in photographs. His first smile. The way he started grabbing at things. Brenda sent me a video of him laughing at the dog from next door, and I watched it 40 times in a row. I was going to get back to him. That was the only thing I kept telling myself, one session at a time. The first time I stood without support, I cried again. But that was a different kind of crying. The physiotherapist, a quietly methodical woman named Dr. Yoon, stood beside me and said nothing. She'd learned by then that I didn't want to be congratulated mid-effort. Just witnessed. I went home in March. Owen was almost 8 months old. He looked at me in the doorway of Brenda's apartment. I'd moved in with her temporarily while my house was sorted, because Nathan had technically still been on the lease and there were complications. And he stared at me with that serious, assessing face that babies do, like he was making a decision about me. Then he reached for me. I sat down right there on Brenda's hallway floor and held him for a long time. Nathan paid child support because the court made him. He saw Owen approximately 4 times in the first year after I came home. 3 of those times were around Christmas, and I suspected at least one of them was motivated by a photo opportunity, because there was a picture of the two of them on his Facebook that got a lot of comments about what a wonderful father he was. I went back to work part-time at 18 months post-injury. The organization I worked for had been patient. I'd kept in touch, done what remote work I could during recovery, and they found me a coordinator role that didn't require field deployment. It paid reasonably well enough that between my salary and the child support and the small amount of savings I'd held onto through the divorce, Owen and I were stable. We moved to Guelph when Owen was 3. I wanted a fresh start, and Brenda had a friend there who was renting out the upper floor of a house on a quiet street 2 blocks from a good school. We planted tomatoes in the backyard planter boxes. Owen named each one. He was very serious about it. Nathan sent cards sometimes. Birthday, Christmas. Owen would look at them, and then set them aside and go back to whatever he'd been doing. By the time Owen was 6, he'd stopped asking when his dad was coming to visit. That was the part that was hardest to watch. Not the anger. Owen didn't have much anger about it, not then. Just the gradual, quiet process of a child reorganizing his understanding of the world to accommodate an absence. He stopped setting a place for his father in the imaginary restaurants he set up in our living room. He stopped drawing families with 4 people. I didn't say anything bad about Nathan. I want to be clear about that. When Owen asked, I said his dad loved him but had some things he needed to work on. When Owen was 9 and asked me directly, "Does Dad even want to see me?" I said I thought his dad had made some choices that were hard to understand, but that wasn't about Owen, it was about Dad. Owen thought about that for a while and said, okay. He was already at 9, a more measured person than his father had ever been. He was also, by 11, building things. Circuits, mostly. He'd gotten into electronics through a school program. One of those extracurricular enrichment things that the school board offered on Saturday mornings. And he took to it immediately, the way some kids take to music or sports. His teacher, a retired engineer named Mr. Abbott, called me one afternoon to say he'd never had a student quite like Owen in 20 years of running the program. I drove Owen to that program every Saturday for 3 years. I was usually the one who waited in the parking lot reading, and then drove him home listening to him explain what he'd made that morning. I understood about 20% of what he said. I nodded and asked questions anyway. When Owen was 12, he won a regional science competition. The prize was modest, a certificate, a small scholarship toward educational materials, but the local paper ran a short piece on it. A photo of Owen holding his project board, grinning in a way he almost never let me photograph. I framed it and put it on the wall in our kitchen. That was in October. In January, I got a letter from a lawyer in Mississauga. Nathan was filing for full custody. I read the letter 3 times standing at my kitchen counter. Then I put it down, went and checked on Owen. He was in his room, headphones on, completely absorbed in something on his laptop. And then I went into the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub for a while. I wasn't scared, exactly. I was something else. Something that felt like a very cold, very clear kind of fury. He hadn't seen Owen in over a year. He'd called twice in the past 8 months, both times when Owen had mentioned it first in a text, both calls lasting less than 15 minutes. He had paid child support because the original court order required automatic deduction from his paycheck. Not because he'd ever once sent a voluntary dollar. And now he wanted full custody. I called my lawyer, a woman named Ms. Whitfield, who I'd used during the original divorce proceedings and trusted completely. I left a message. She called me back within 2 hours. "Tell me everything," she said. I did. When I finished, there was a brief silence, then she said, "He's going to have a very hard time making this argument." "I know," I said. "I just want to make sure we make that clear to a judge." Nathan's legal argument, as it turned out, was built around a few things. His financial situation had improved significantly. He'd been promoted, was earning more, had a stable home with Tara. They'd married the year before. He argued that Owen's needs would be better served in a parent household. He argued that I had historically been absent due to my work. He submitted documentation about my original deployment and the accident, and my rehabilitation as evidence that my lifestyle created instability. It was a creative approach. I'll give him that. Ms. Whitfield and I prepared carefully. We gathered Owen's school records, excellent, consistent, no flags. We gathered his extracurricular documentation, his awards, letters from Mr. Abbott and 2 other teachers. We had Nathan's visitation record, which we obtained through the court file. The number of documented visits in 11 years was 23. In 11 years. I remember Ms. Whitfield writing that number on a notepad and underlining it twice. We had my employment record. We had my medical file, which documented my rehabilitation timeline, my return to work progression, my current clean bill of health. We had a letter from Dr. Yuan, who had written several paragraphs about my recovery and what she described as my exceptional commitment and consistency throughout a prolonged and difficult rehabilitation process. We had everything. I had kept everything. Owen knew there was a court date. I told him honestly, in terms that were appropriate for his age, that his father wanted to make a change to our arrangement and that a judge would listen to everyone and decide. Owen asked if he'd have to talk to anyone. You might be asked to speak with someone, not the judge directly, a counselor who helps the judge understand what you want, I told him. You don't have to say anything you're not comfortable with. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to stay here. I know, I said. I know. The court date was on a Wednesday in April. I wore the navy blazer I'd bought for job interviews and I arrived 40 minutes early. Owen was at school. Brenda had driven up the night before and was at home with him. Nathan arrived with Tara and their lawyer, a man with expensive shoes and a manner that suggested he was used to winning. Nathan looked, I thought, like someone who had convinced himself this was already decided. He looked at me across the waiting area and gave me a small nod. Like we were colleagues about to go into a meeting, like this was an ordinary thing. Miss Whitfield put a hand briefly on my arm. Ready? I nodded. The hearing unfolded the way these things do, formal, measured, slower than you'd imagine. Nathan's lawyer made his opening argument about stability, resources, Owen's need for both parents. Nathan himself spoke, talked about wanting to be present in his son's life, about how much he'd grown, about the home he could offer. I sat still and I listened. I had learned over the years that there was a kind of power in stillness. Nathan had never understood that. He'd always needed to fill space. When it was our turn, Ms. Whitfield walked the judge through the record. 11 years. 23 documented visits. Child support paid automatically, never voluntarily increased despite Nathan's salary nearly doubling. 0 involvement in Owen's schooling, his medical appointments, his extracurriculars. Then she submitted my employment file. Your Honor, she said, the opposing counsel has characterized my client's history as demonstrating instability. I'd like to draw your attention to the assessment included on page 4 of the employment file, specifically the section completed after her return to work. The judge turned to page 4. I watched Nathan from across the room. I watched him try to look composed. The judge read. He didn't rush. When he looked up, he looked at Nathan's lawyer first, then at Nathan. Counsel, he said, your client's argument appears to center significantly on your opposing party's reliability and consistency. I'm looking at an assessment here that describes her as, he glanced back at the page, one of the most resilient and dependable coordinators in the organization's history, with particular commendation for her management of a multi-team response during a period when she was, by her own disclosure, still managing the late stages of her physical recovery. He set the page down. Meanwhile, I have before me a visitation record showing 23 visits over 11 years. The room was very quiet. Nathan's lawyer said something about the visits having been affected by distance and work schedules. The judge listened. He did not look convinced. The judge also at one point asked the question directly. He asked Nathan's lawyer, how many of the last 12 months' birthdays, school events, and medical appointments can your client document attendance for? There was a pause. Your Honor, my client is committed to. That wasn't the question. Owen's counselor, who had met with him the week before, submitted her notes. Owen had, when asked what he wanted, been clear and calm and specific in the way that 11-year-olds can sometimes be when adults give them the space to actually think. He wanted to stay in Guelph. He wanted to stay in his school. He wanted to keep going to Saturday electronics. He said his dad could visit if he wanted to, but he didn't want to move. The judge did not take long. He awarded continued primary custody to me. He established a formal visitation schedule for Nathan, structured, documented, with specific provisions for what would happen if visits were missed. He noted in his written remarks, which I read that evening at my kitchen table while Owen was in bed, that the court had been unable to identify any credible basis for disrupting what was, by all evidence, a stable and nurturing environment, and that the evidence of the non-custodial parent's prior absence was a significant factor in the determination. He also ordered Nathan to pay my legal costs. I called Brenda from the parking lot. She answered on the first ring. Well, she said, We won. She made a sound I can't fully describe. Relief, I think, mixed with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding tension in their body for months on behalf of someone they love. Come home, she said. I'll put the kettle on. Owen was still up when I got back, even though it was past 9. He was sitting on the couch with his electronics kit spread across the coffee table, building something with small resistors and a breadboard. He looked up when I came in. How'd it go? He asked. Good, I said. We're staying put. He nodded, like this confirmed something he'd already decided was true. Then he looked back at his project. I'm trying to get this LED to pulse instead of just stay on. It's the resistor value, I think. Okay, I said. I sat down on the other end of the couch and tucked my feet up. Show me. He explained it to me the way he always did. I understood maybe 30%. I asked questions anyway. Nathan did use his visitation time at first. He came 3 times that spring and summer, stiffly with Tara, who always looked faintly uncomfortable. Owen was polite. He was never cruel, never cold, just carefully, quietly himself. He didn't ask Nathan to prove anything. He didn't give him a chance to disappoint him by expecting too much. He had already done the work, somewhere inside himself, of deciding who mattered and building his life around those people. I watched this happen, and I didn't know whether to be proud or heartbroken. I settled eventually on both. The following spring, Owen's electronics teacher put him forward for a provincial competition. He placed 2nd overall. The prize included a scholarship toward a STEM summer program at the University of Waterloo. On the night we found out, we went out for pizza. Brenda had driven up again for the occasion, and Owen ordered the one he always ordered, the one with too many toppings. And he talked the entire meal about what he was going to build when he got to the summer program. At one point, Brenda raised her glass of pop and said, "To Owen." Owen looked a little embarrassed. "It's just 2nd place," he said. "It's not just 2nd place," I told him. "It's 2nd in the province." He thought about that. "Okay," he said. "Fair." We clinked glasses. The restaurant was loud and warm and smelled like garlic bread. Owen had sauce on his chin and didn't notice. Brenda made a face at me across the table, and I pressed my lipstick there to keep from laughing. I have thought since then about the thing the judge read. One paragraph in a 12-page employment file. I hadn't even remembered it was there until Ms. Whitfield found it during document prep and read it out to me over the phone. I'd been on the team that organized the relief effort after a secondary flooding event in the fall of the year I came back, when I was still doing modified duties, still seeing Dr. Yuan twice a month, still some mornings having to think carefully about how I was going to get down the stairs, and someone had written it down. Someone had noticed and written it down. I think about that sometimes, how much of our lives goes unrecorded. How much of the work we do, the invisible work, the daily repetition of choosing not to fall apart, never ends up anywhere official, and then sometimes it does. Sometimes it ends up on page 4 of a document, and a judge reads it in a quiet courtroom, and the person across the room goes pale. Nathan never apologized. I didn't expect him to. Some people are capable of leaving without ever fully understanding that leaving was a choice. He had told himself a story about circumstances and difficulty, and what he could and couldn't bear. That was his story to carry. Mine was different. Mine was about the particular stubbornness of learning to walk again with a 4-month-old son you're doing it for. About a sister who moved into a fold-out bed and stayed. About a boy who grew up in a too-small apartment in Guelph and named each tomato plant individually and eventually placed 2nd in the province. Owen is 13 now. He has a bit of a teenager's reserve creeping in at the edges, the earbuds, the door closing, but he still talks to me, still tells me about the circuits. Last month he explained to me the difference between analog and digital signals using a cereal box and a glass of water, and I didn't understand most of it, but I got enough. I always get enough. We're okay. More than okay. We're the kind of okay that's been built carefully by 2 people who decided to show up for each other every single day, even when that was hard. That's not a ribbon. There's no ceremony for it. But I know what it cost, and I know what it's worth. And honestly, that's enough for me.